So let's think about gain staging here. There's a lot of conflicting information online. Maybe you read that you should always set your oscillators and envelope amount to 60%. And I'm just going by my ears here, but here's what I think of it. I think of 5 main areas that change to the level of a patch, not counting the filters. You got your mixer levels, your amp envelope amount, your distortion, program level, and your master volume. So which changes will change the timbre of the sound and which ones will just make it louder? High oscillator volume can cause a filter to produce its own distortion, and lots of synths offer ways of doing this. After giving myself a blind listening test, I was able to guess between the oscillator volume being at maximum or at 60% about 50% of the time. In other words, there isn't any audible filter saturation on the Prophet 6, at least not to my ears, and I'm a pretty close listener. I controlled my experiment by setting the volume levels to be equal down to 1/10 of a decibel. But if you turn your oscillators down low enough, you will raise your noise floor, which could be a reason people think that it sounds warmer. I know there was an old comparison online that I listened to that I was able to pick out the difference between something like 80% of the time. It was supposed to be the same test, but I think the difference was I used my low pass filter on my test. So there is an audible difference in the super high frequencies of the oscillators themselves, but only if you don't use the low pass filter. So why all the hullabaloo with setting low volumes? It's a whole different story when the distortion knob gets involved. If you give a distortion circuit a lot of input gain, you're going to get a lot more of a distorted signal. Most of the time, that's not what I want. I want a touch of distortion, some subtle warmth, if you will. So here I have oscillator 1 set to about 60% and envelope amount set to 60%. And my distort knob, I'm going to turn up to just the minimum audible distortion I can get. So it's about in between 8 and 9 o'clock. It's a little bit twiddly, but you can get nice saturation this way. Now let's try a different setting. I'm going to set oscillator 1 to about 40% and the envelope also around there. So really, really low. And I'm going to crank up the distortion to somewhere in between 75% and the maximum. So here we've sacrificed some volume to be able to fine-tune our distortion a little bit more. And I prefer this because I'd rather have more control over the distortion itself. As for changing the program volume and master volume, they're just making things louder and quieter. They don't actually change the timbre. Alright, next let's talk about oscillator sync. Oscillator sync adds harmonics kind of like FM does. Think of using it when you want to emphasize higher frequencies. It works by restarting oscillator 1's oscillation according to whenever oscillator 2 says to do it, which is when it oscillates. You probably don't want to emphasize harmonics that don't have a lot in common with whatever note oscillator 1 is playing because it'll just sound metallic. But even if you pick a note that's very related to oscillator 1's note, like an octave or a fifth, you'll catch a taste of metal, especially in the high frequencies. When the high frequency content is so full, it can even start to sound like a noise oscillator is mixed in. Let's take a listen. So I'm going to tune oscillator 1 to a C3 and oscillator 2 to a C2 and sync them up. And do you hear that noise? I'm gonna, in the high frequencies, if I just turn on oscillator 2 instead, It's really smooth. You can also try tuning Oscillator 1 to a G2. So that's a fifth above Oscillator 2, and try hitting some high notes. It's really smooth and almost crystalline. There's nothing wrong with cold tones in the upper register, but I'm not going to get into any more sync tones for pads because they really are pretty cold. It's great for effects though. Well, this just about does it for my series on pads. There were a few topics we didn't really get into, like keyboard tracking. And if you don't know how to make full keyboard tracking sound warm and natural, then check out my video in the cards, because it's a super useful trick. But for pads, it's pretty much about balancing the volumes and overall emphasis of notes. If you want the higher notes to come through super nice and loud with a lot of presence, then use more keyboard tracking. And if you want lower notes to be louder and more aggressive, then use less keyboard tracking. And I don't think I talked much about using the filter envelope, but well, you can figure that part out on your own. Till next time.